Morning, everyone. Thank you so much to Dr. Jaiswal for inviting the Clean Energy Research Group. I'm here representing Simon Fraser University with my two colleagues, Prasanna, Krishnan, and Feyza Sahinyazan. We're just going to give you a brief overview of what the activities of our group are, and we'll be quite open to questions afterwards. I'll just begin with a brief overview for 10 minutes of the group and then turn it over to Mr. Krishnan. I'm just going to share my screen now, and this will give you an orientation about the Clean Energy Research Group and its activities. So the Clean Energy Research Group came out of a development conference in Vancouver in 2018. And the main focus was to try to bring practitioners, policymakers, and researchers together for the purpose of addressing climate change. While we see that this climate change issue is a global issue, it's multifaceted, and Western countries are making some progress, albeit halting, in terms of addressing overall emissions. We believe that many of the issues at the community level of those who are most marginalized in the world, including Indigenous communities in Canada, remain unaddressed, and they have to be part of the solution for climate change. So the purpose of our group is to try to bring policymakers, practitioners, and researchers together to try to find solutions for these marginalized groups. We are a research group that is based out of Simon Fraser University, and what we attempt to do is mix a input of technical capability from our engineering group, of social science and policy capability with our social sciences group, and business capability and economics capability with our members from the business community. And we try to mix research with practical policy advice. So in a sense, we see ourselves as a community of practice. As you can see from the photo in this slide, we have good relationships with local First Nations communities, many of whom are at the forefront of creating new clean energy projects. And we believe that these small experiments can provide a good example or model for other marginalized communities around the world to happen. We also see the importance of having a neutral nonprofit group offering advice to marginalized communities in a space that is overrun with international organizations and consultants who have their own agendas. Why do we focus on community power? Well, we all know that there are over 1 billion people around the world who don't have access to regular grid power. This includes many marginalized communities, particularly Indigenous communities in North America, in Canada, and the United States. And we all know that energy is one of the key nodes, one of the key obstacles preventing marginalized communities and groups from entering the mainstream and overcoming development obstacles. We also see at the same time that with technological progress, with the economics, for example, of solar panels declining very fast, that there is ever more viable pathways to create decentralized power so that marginalized communities don't have to wait for an oftentimes unwieldy and incapable state to provide grid access. And in many cases, these marginalized communities face geographic barriers. With the increasingly attractive economics of renewable energy, whether it's wind, solar, or geothermal, there are already technical solutions. However, there still remain serious economic and financial institutions, and there remain serious political and governance obstacles to overcome to be able to demonstrate the viability of these decentralized power grids, whether they're at the household level or at the community level. We believe by examining community power experiments and showing ways that these obstacles have been overcome, we can start to develop a global model or a framework that can inform other communities' efforts to develop their own renewable power sources. And so we are very interested in meeting with global partners around the world to understand their efforts at renewable decentralized power. We are interested in academic contacts as well as government and NGO and community contacts. There are some sources of funding in Canada that would allow for international and global collaboration. And we see our potential role as taking what the private sector or nonprofit sector is doing, these million experiments that are happening in community power around the world, and synthesizing lessons so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel with every new project. We also believe that it's important to inform the public about all these experiments and the possibilities. In many cases in these marginalized communities, the obstacles for governance, for reaching consensus, for moving towards community planning are as great as the economic and financial obstacles. And so we're seeking ways to work with partners to create frameworks, models, and find funding sources to help communities overcome them. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Sahinyazan, who's from our business school.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for this invitation. It is great to be here. I will briefly talk about a recent study that we have conducted on renewable mini-grids and potential success and failure reasons for these projects. So this is a joint work with my colleague Fraser from University of Calgary, and we were interested in the renewable energy mini-grid projects as the clean energy was becoming cheaper and solar costs especially is decreasing constantly. And we realized that the off-grid renewable energies are currently serving 150 million people, but by 2030, it's expected to reach 500 million people through more than 200,000 mini-grid projects. And there's an expected investment of $12 billion for these type of projects. But unfortunately, 60% of the renewable mini-grid projects that are installed for the off-grid communities are abandoned within 6 months of installation. So it is very important to understand the main reasons behind these failures so that the future investments can be made in a way that will be more sustainable. And even the studies that are reporting failures, usually we know that the failures are often underreported. So there can be even a greater potential for failure, which is not reported properly. When we look at the barriers to success, we saw that there is a substantial body of guidelines, white papers, and great literatures examining these subjects, but there were very limited evidence-based empirical studies. And with this study, we aimed to fill this gap. We have actually constructed a novel data set of 104 such mini-grid projects installed all over the world. Obviously, there are much more mini-grid projects than we have analyzed, but we were interested in the projects where the public data is available in terms of their costs, capacity. So we synthesize a context-specific qualitative insights from these projects, as well as an empirical and statistical tests for potential success and failure results. In our data set, the one that we've constructed, there were all types of projects. We didn't only focus on the solar, but there were some wind, hydro, and biomass projects too, and different ownership models. So in order to control if the ownership structure has an impact on the success of the project, we have included public, private, or community-based projects in our data set as well. And we were interested in the implications of the selected technology, such as the wind, solar, hydro, or if there's a battery available, if there's a demand management smart meter type available on the project costs and success. We were also interested in if the ownership structure has a significant effect on the cost and success. As I said, we had 104 mini-grid projects to start with to conduct our statistical analyses. I will not go over all the technical details of this model, but as I've said, we were interested in two major outcomes. One is the project cost, and the other one is the project success. And the data, as I mentioned, is as balanced as possible in the sense that the different ownership structures were relatively commonly represented. Also, the regions, as you can see, from the Americas, we had 30% of the projects, Africa 30% of the projects, and Asia Pacific 40% of the projects. In terms of the renewable proportion, we have looked into purely renewable projects and also the ones that are in cooperation with the diesel generators, so hybrid type of projects as well. And we realized that the keys to the project success from our qualitative analyses is that the one and most important part is the community involvement. So the projects that are designed from a top-down approach, where the public body is installed the project and let the people use it afterwards, are usually doomed to fail because the demand patterns or the needs of the communities are not considered during the project planning. Also, another common failure was, even if the project at the beginning initially installed very successfully, if there is no training provided for the community to ensure the maintenance of the system can be taken care of within the community, the project is again doomed to fail. The presence of the local repair parts, the storage, was also another important factor. And also the energy storage capability. As we all know, the renewable energy can be very intermittent, and the projects that are lacking a battery, for example, were failing a bit more quickly. So in that sense, we believe that, for example, my expertise is on supply chain management and logistics. I would like to emphasize and maybe conclude my part with that point. These collaborations and communications between different groups and different domains is very important, and all these aspects in terms of the logistics. So it's not about just investing the project or installing the project, but ensuring the distribution of the spare parts, ensuring building the local capacity is also a very important point. So the renewable future of the world, I think it depends on strong collaborations among different global partners from different domains. So thank you very much. I think that would conclude my part.
Thanks, Dr. Sahinyazan. That was a great presentation and right on time, very efficient. I'll turn it over now to our colleague, Mr. Krishnan.
Thank you, Dr. Hira, and thank you to the NICE team and Professor Jaiswal for organizing and for having an opportunity to present. My name is Prasanna Krishnan. I am a solar energy engineer and independent consultant, and I collaborate with Dr. Hira and the SFU SERB group on more on the technical aspects of community renewable energy. And this presentation is based on some learnings through a recent project where we looked at a guide for community renewable energy. As well, it draws upon my experience as an engineer. I've worked and deployed about 1 gigawatt worth of primarily solar power projects. However, these are often utility scale and not small community projects. And I've worked on a certain amount of community projects that also overlap here in the content of this presentation. I'm also glad Dr. Sahinyazan has gone ahead of me and has provided some examples, which I can use to tie down some of the content I have here. So, there are many benefits to employing community renewable energy systems. For one, there is a greater price control that the community has over the supply of energy once the project is underway and at a mature operating level. We have a predictable, in most cases, price. There are, of course, many direct and indirect health benefits, while it's quite generally accepted that the transition to renewable energy helps with climate change. One particularly interesting example to note are those of island communities and or smaller communities where they use diesel grids for generation and they have to ship in diesel fuel. One such project that our group is going to be involved with in the weeks and months to come is working with the Hira community in our part of the world, where they do have some renewable energy as well as some diesel. And we are going to be collaborating with them on aiding that transition to a 100% renewable energy grid. Another benefit is the supply. Once again, in terms of control, there's a more predictable supply of energy. I believe in many parts of the world, there are frequent outages and unpredictable supply from the grid operators. A mini grid, for example, or even a smaller installation for community will allow them greater control over the supply of electricity. Of course, as Dr. Sahinyazan has mentioned, the most important benefit is the actual community building aspect. This is perhaps hard to quantify, and I'm sure there are many methods to do so, but it's clear that on the outcome side, it's why the community strength is so important, as it gives the entire community a sense of ownership and involvement in the operation and administration of the facility. Finally, in both economic terms, in terms of creating opportunities and jobs within the community, which is another benefit and key factor in the longevity of the mini grids that Dr. Sahinyazan presented, there are also economies of scale to be taken advantage of. If perhaps one homeowner in a community would like to install renewable energy and they're able to spread and share that idea and the community decides to install a project together, they now have a collective stronger buying power. I'll quickly go over some common types of renewable energies. There's solar PV that are used in community projects, wind, biomass, biogas facilities, as well as geothermal, often used for district heating. Of course, the list doesn't stop here. There can be hybrid systems, such as in the Hira community that I mentioned. There are also microgrids comprised of different components. So it can be quite a mix what constitutes a community renewable energy project. And let's dive right into the development process a little bit more. I've viewed the process as sort of two phases. The first phase, there are a lot of overlapping activities. And in the second phase, it's more sequential. I'll also add a disclaimer that this is largely based on my experience working in North America. And while these broad categories of activities are necessary in all projects, of course, they do need to be adapted for local conditions. So with that, there's the most important piece, which is the community vision. As Dr. Hira talked about, particularly working with Indigenous communities, we want to respect and keep in the forefront the principles of United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. I myself am not an expert in that, and however, that's one of the strengths of our SWU CERT group, is that we have multidisciplinary experts who are able to bring in that piece. So it's important to get the community around the vision that they want, not only for the energy project, however, what they envision for their community as a whole. As part of that and overlapping with that is assessing what are the locally available resources and what are the best locations to deploy this. One of the partners that Dr. Hira showed a picture of is the Kanaka Bar Indian band, again, located in our part of the world, in Canada. And their strengths in located in a mountain valley, they're not able to install wide areas of solar projects. However, they have a river nearby and they're able to exploit that for run-of-river small hydro projects. Other locations, for example, Indigenous communities in the eastern part of Canada, in Quebec, they have a lot of wind and they've set up very large-scale wind power Along with that location and technology assessment, it's also important to look at the environmental and cultural assessments, ensure that the appropriate mitigation strategies are taken. For example, in parts of California, there are endangered species for which any renewable energy or project developer must set aside mitigation land. So in this way, there may be certain local regulations that one must observe, or that the community must observe. And the third overlapping aspect of the development process, which is, let's call it to the stage where there is a perhaps a signed agreement or a signed agreement within the community and with partners to move forward with the projects. There's the ownership and financing model. I'll get right into that in the next page here. As Dr. Sahinyazan also alluded to, there are several forms of ownerships. Broadly speaking, there's a cooperative or community owned, where there's active participation and in fact financial return from the community members. There may be partnerships where there's part of the community's stake in there, as well as a corporate partner. There are social enterprises, which again are similar to generally a corporation, however, or a private business. However, it has a stated social purpose and how it must also destine its funds. And finally, we have nonprofit structures that generally take advantage of donations, and they're favorably structured. Once again, in North America, with respect to tax structure and to allow them to take donations, which again have a social purpose. Each of these, of course, will influence the financing model. Generally speaking, a project is financed through a combination of different mechanisms. There may be grants and or government funding, or foundations, private foundations that have funds to just provide. There are also equity forms of structure where investors will take a stake in a project and they're expected a return based on the, but however, they're also committed to the writing the project's risks and benefits. And finally, there's debt, which is broadly speaking a class of funding that that banks would provide, where there is a guaranteed often payment that they're expecting irrespective of the project's cash flows. Within that, there are many, many more creative models for financing. So once that piece is almost mature for the proposed project, it can be transitioned over to what I'd like to think of as the second phase of development, which is the building and the engineering part. As an engineer, this is a little bit more of my strong point, and I'd be able to talk about a little bit more perhaps drawbacks and pitfalls that one can be cautious of. In the engineering phase, there are often coordinations if this is going to be connected to the local utility in order to make sure that all the electrical characteristics match. Furthermore, detailed design and engineering of the project will take place. Following that, there's the construction phase where the engineering plans are, of course, built. This often is undertaken by one firm called the Engineering, Procurement, and Construction Firm. And so for interested participants and viewers who are thinking about working with their community on a project, I would recommend not only for this, but even for the other phases of development, is to really do your best due diligence on the partners that you choose to work with, as it can be, there are unscrupulous actors who can take advantage of communities and especially government available funding. One way to do that is to have strong supporters who are well versed in the legal considerations in your particular region that are able to help structure contracts that are in your favor. And finally, once the construction is complete, the project goes through a commissioning phase where it's tested and put into operation and enters the operation and maintenance. And this is again, once again, going back to Dr. Sahinyazan's presentation, another strong element of winning local microgrid projects, which is involving the local community in operations and maintenance, and really allowing people to have a stake in it. And this also comprises the aspect of asset management, which is generally related to the financial administration of the project. That's depending on the ownership structure and the financial structure that are chosen. These are some references for community ownership models. I'm sure we'll find a way to also share this information. And with that, I'll conclude my presentation, and I thank you for your time.
Very good morning, one and all, and thanks to the organizer for this opportunity to present here. And talking about this presentation, so it's a interdisciplinary approach. I actually work in the Department of Social Sciences, and this particular work is an extension of my PhD research work, which I've completed something around 3 years back. And slightly have included few important parts in this, topic. So it is all about a study of climate change policy in India. So here I will exclusively focus on India and how the other, how other countries, like since it's a comparative perspective, I'll just take few countries which are developed in nature, as well as they are having some sort of practices of federalism, because this study is basically from Indian point of view, that India, how the center-state relationship is actually located, and how the center-state relationship is taking this matter of climate change as a serious threat to the human being, and what are the possible, what are the policies have been taken by both the government as well as the non-government organizations. So my study is going to address these things. Since I have a time constraint, I think 7 minutes, so I'll just try to complete within the given time. Sure, let me just start the presentation. Yes. So basically, this when we talk about this climate change, it's a serious threat that we know that the entire humanity is facing. And when we talk about that, how can we just address this issue, not from the domestic perspective, but from the international perspective. But when we see that this climate change is a serious threat, that means we cannot solve it from, if one or two countries or few countries will try from their end. So it's very difficult to address this particular challenge. That means we need a joint effort. So, and when we talk about the joint effort, so we need international cooperation in this respect. So let us just talk about the UNFCCC or some of the other international initiatives. But when we talk about the seriousness, so somewhere we lack clarity. So one such example, when we talk about the carbon cap, or the emission, the per capita income, per capita emission level. So in per capita income, emission level, when we talk about the developed countries, just take the example of this BRIC, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. So when we compare these countries with the US or even China, so we will see like the per capita emission is comparatively more higher. So when there is a restriction, when it is a binding factor for the developing countries like India, which is a developing stage in the process of development, and we cannot stop the transportation sector, we cannot stop this industrialization, or we cannot stop this economic activities. So at the same time, because people are suffering here, like when we talk about the poverty, when we talk about the unemployment ratio, which is at its peak. So at this same time, so we have to also manage this particular aspect, because climate change is a serious threat and we need to address this particular part. And when we talk about this particular aspect, that means we should manage or compromise to a certain extent, that to what extent we can emit, or which are the possible policy alternatives. Should we focus more on the adaptation part, or should we move to the mitigation part? Because when we talk about the climate change, many a times we feel that this mitigation is the only factor, but it is not the case. But when we talk about the adaptation as a strategy, so this adaptation can also help in to a greater extent. But the problem is, for adaptation, we need huge investment. And one of the important parts when we talk about a particular aspect, like think globally and think locally and act globally. So that can be, one of the important aspects which may help to a certain extent. I'll just cover in my discussion. So this is all about, just a second. Yes. So this particular study is actually, it's a policy-based study, and it highlights the importance of climate change issues in Indian federal setup. Why I've taken this federal setup, so let me just tell you that when we talk about the center-state relationship, so sometimes, so there is a policy, vacuum. There is a policy gap between the center and the state, because sometimes the central government in many countries, they are having a centralizing policy making, policy making. And in that particular context, the states or the units in a federation, there are hardly any, power in the policy making, perspective. So as far as India is concerned, so when we talk about post 2008, because 2008, in India, is one of the important landmarks, because when we talk about the National Action Plan on Climate Change, which is a first ever policy document which have been drafted and prepared by the government of India. And then the government of India direct all the states to start and to implement their own state action plan which sync to the national level policy and objectives. So that means there was a funding for the states, for the units in a federation. That means the states were also prepared, and they also address the issues of climate change with consultation with the central government. So that means for the first time since this National Action Plan on Climate Change that came into being, so there was a serious attempt from the government of India. So when we talk about some of the other countries, I'll just discuss in the next slide. So this is basically the federal setup, and the study has exclusively focused on this post National Action Plan on Climate Change, which is 2008 and onwards. And this study scrutinizes the perspective of the states on the role of the centralized policy making and its impact on the program implementation at the ground level. So that means, because when we talk about the ground level, that means we are very much looking into the bottom of approach, because this top-down approach is not going to help, because we have already experienced since the last, since the Rio conference. You can talk about 1972, 1990s. So many international, level negotiations have been taken place, but still we are unable to, meet the targets. So because it's a challenge, then we need to understand that why we fail to achieve this particular aspect, whether it is the international community which is responsible, or it is the domestic policy which is propelling to look into the developmental agendas and aspects. So here the study actually it analyzes various practices of federalism and climate change internationally. I have selected a few countries, and I'll just focus on what are the data. And this is all about the vulnerability mapping in India. So when we talk about the vulnerability mapping, so it includes so many components here which are actually directly or indirectly responsible for this particular aspect. We can talk about the economic perspective, the economic growth, rapid industrialization, transportation sector, modernizing agriculture. So all these factors are also responsible partially, we can say. So German was 2017 that says that Global Climate Risk Index that ranks India as the 4th major affected countries which have received extreme weather events into 2015. And during the last 6 odd years, so when we talk about the 5 to 6 years, so many, the country has suffered drastically in terms of all the natural hazards. And if we'll just take into account these hazards, so it is huge as far as the human loss as well as the material loss. So when we talk about this impact of climate change in India, it can be broadly extended to 5 sectors. So these are the sectors: forest, ecosystem, coastal areas, human health, agriculture, and water resources. So what is most important part here is the key challenge that need to be understood, that climate change in a federal context, it need to think nationally and act locally. And when we talk about entering into the international treaty or joint discussion, which can also solve this particular issue, then we can say that both the state, the non-state actors, they should play its role. So at the international level, we can talk about the international community should join hands together. This is all about the policy priorities. So I have included two important strategies. One is this adaptation. Second one is this mitigation part. So adaptation basically involves taking practical actions to manage risk from the climate impacts. And it basically protects communities, and it strengthens the resilience of the economy. Secondly, when we talk about this mitigation part, so it reduces the emission, and it stabilizes the levels of heat trapping, greenhouse gases, and etc. So yes, so this is all about a comparative perspective. Here I have selected a few countries where there is a practice of federalism, and to a certain extent, because all these countries are not in equal state of condition as far as federalism is concerned, because some countries are known as purely federal state like US or Canada. Some states are known as asymmetric federalism. Some states are known as less federal, more unitary in nature. So, but at least there is a practice of federalism, and there is a seriousness to address the issues of climate change, domestically. So this is all about it says the study of global emissions. I have included a few countries here like China, USA, European Union, India, Russia, Japan, Brazil, Indonesia, Canada, and Mexico. And if you just look at this particular figure, so it says that the global emitters of greenhouse gases by 2017, and it includes, like, it says like China is leading, and with almost 27%, that means almost 1/4 of the global greenhouse gas emission. So next is the United States. So when we talk about the per capita emission level, so you see the China, USA, so they are leading the race. So this is all about the global greenhouse gas emission. And we can say that carbon dioxide is leading again almost 65% of the entire emission level. And this is this case study of Russia. In Russia, actually, I have included the Russian Federation. So these are the sectors which are responsible for, these are the emission energy sector, which includes around 82% of the total emission. Then the industrial sector includes almost close to 8%. Agricultural sector comes next around 7%. Then waste and the solvent sectors. When we talk about this Canada's perspective, in Canada also, so these are again, we can find like energy sector is again leading the race, but in Canada, transportation sector and energy sector are actually responsible for more greenhouse gases. And this is for the Brazil. So when we talk about this Brazil's experience, again, energy sector, and then comes this, industrial sector. So these are the sectors. That means when we talk about these countries, so more or less they are similar in their approach, like industrial sector or transportation sector leading the race. Even the case is quite similar in Australia also. It's 78% greenhouse gases emission is just because of this energy sector, and then comes the industrial process. So this is all about a policy and institutional framework I have included here. So that means when I talk about that the domestic policy, the seriousness, the attempt have been taken by India. So this is all about the guiding principle to address the this climate change issue. And this is a policy document based on this 2008 Government of India report, that is National Action Plan on Climate Change. These are the guiding principles. So it includes inclusive and sustainable development strategy, economic growth, objective to include access to enhance ecological sustainability, then efficiency and cost effectiveness in managing these greenhouse gases, and this technological innovation for both adaptation as well as mitigation strategies, involvement of NGOs, local bodies, and public-private partnership in the implementation perspective, then encouragement of international cooperation for research, transfer of technology, and fundings. And so let me just tell you that when we talk about the adaptation, which is a very costly affair, because when we talk about switching to the E mode, that means switching to the green mode, use of green technologies, sustainable agriculture, solar energy, biomass, tide energy, and that means we are talking about the non-conventional sources of energy, which is a very costly affair for a country like India, because we need huge investment. And when we talk about the emission level, so when there is any decision at the international platform, that means when countries are imposing restriction on a country which is developing in nature, so it's very difficult for them to accept, because they need to look at their development first, then they can think about the this climate change perspective. But we cannot deny that climate change is a serious threat. But yes, we know that. But at the same time, we should find some policy alternatives which can help in this particular direction. So this is a policy institutional framework. This is exclusively for India and pre-National Action Plan on Climate Change. That means this particular figure, it shows that there was a less amount of seriousness as far as the Indian government is concerned before 2008, because there was a Minister of External Affairs which was heading this particular, addressing this particular issue, Ministry of Environment and Forest, National Clean Development Mechanism Authority or CDM Authority. Then some sectoral ministries were there, like Ministry of Power, which was responsible in providing technical inputs. And when we talk about the post-2008, the things got changed. Just imagine that within a span of 2 to 3 years, just after the formation of National Action Plan on Climate Change, so that particular ministry, that particular policy institution that got enlarged, that became, large one, because the PMO's office was involved in that, then Prime Minister's Council on Climate Change, then some of the executive standing committees on climate change. That means some seriousness were, tried from the government part. And when we talk about, because we have already experienced more than a decade in the country in terms of addressing these issues of climate change, and it's a great thing to say that in most of the states in the country, we have listed the seriousness on the basis of the seriousness of the hazard, category A and category B states. And on the basis of that, there is a funding from the union government to all the states, and they are implementing their action plan. So that means domestically, to a certain extent, we are addressing these issues and we're working on this particular part. But when it comes to the international perspective, we are still there is a long way to go. And there are certain initiatives like recently, there are certain policies which are just trying to switch to the, green mode. That means to switch from the conventional energy based engines to the non-conventional energy based engines. And one such small example I can give, in the capital of India, Delhi, a few years back, there was an odd even policy. Although we know that it may not contribute significantly, but to a certain extent it has played its role, because odd even policy is something like the odd number of vehicles can fly on a particular day, and the next day the even number of vehicles will able to function. So that means to a certain extent we can control the movement. And in that particular connection, we are trying to, find some alternatives like use of more, railways or even the metros instead of this four-wheeler or two-wheeler in the cities. So these are certain other options. We can also think about some other means of transportation also, so that we can reduce it. So these are certain policy recommendations. I'll take less than 2 minutes to wind up. So these policy recommendations have included two parts. One is this domestic perspective, another is from the international perspective. So the domestic perspective, it includes, like, there are several missions of the National Action Plan on Climate Change, which reflected in the State Action Plan on Climate Change. That means I'm talking about the center-state relationship, the national policy and the state policy hand in hand, that how both policies are quite similar and in what way they're different. So in that particular aspect, we can say that the states, they are having their own state action plan. And here, there is a seriousness. Seriously, we should focus that the state action plan on climate change that have to be mainstreamed in various sectoral programs which have been implemented by the nodal ministries. And these programs need to be revisited in regard to its objectives, focusing on addressing climate change issues. So coordination and convergence of programs and mandates of the institutions should also be given top priorities. That is one of the most important part. And apart from that, the format of the national budget and the state budget should have a component of expenditure incurred towards the climate change and ensuring environmental sustainability. And as far as the present context is concerned, so that they have their own budget, the state and the national, the state and the center. But what is lacking as far as the states are concerned, so all the states are not uniform in nature. That means in terms of the economic perspectives, in terms of the funding amount. So that means that should be proper, set up so that they can just think about it and they can just work efficiently. Then the planning and the governance approach towards addressing the climate change that need to be mainstreamed, broad-based, participatory and collaborative. And the focus should be more on the bottom-up approach that I've already mentioned. That means things should come from the bottom, because the local people, they have better knowledge. They can play a bigger role in the adaptation part, because preparedness is one of the most important aspects than the top-down approach. Because if there will be a central government will frame a particular policy and which is going to be applicable for the entire country, then it may not be perfectly okay. It may not may not solve all the issues. In international perspective, we can say that we need to think locally and act globally, and we need to follow bottom-up approach. Then strict law is required, because emission-based tax can also help into a certain extent. That means countries will think about the emission. That means when I'm talking about think locally and act globally, that means all the countries should think about that how to stop, because this is a serious problem that the entire world is facing. That means we should take initiative from the country's perspective, from the state's perspective, from the region, from the district level, so that we can achieve this particular target. And there is a need of serious attempt, and there should be strict law against this particular emission. Otherwise, it's very difficult. And so with this, I conclude, and I'm expecting 3 questions at the end. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Nayak. I believe we're almost out of time. We'll check with the host to see if there's any time for some quick Q&A. If not, Dr. Sahinyazan and I have both put our emails into the chat box as well as the website for CERD, and we're very happy to continue the conversation via email. Dr. Nayak, if you could stop. Yeah, thank you. So, Dr. Jaiswal, do we have any additional time, or have we run the course of this session? I'm not hearing anything from the chair, so I am open to any further discussion or questions or commentary from the audience. I know that it's early in the morning there and everyone is probably tired, but you have our address. I want to thank you very much for your attention, and I appreciate your attendance. I also want to thank the organizers of the NICE conference. It was a great honor and privilege to be part of this process and to have the ability to network with colleagues from around the globe is a real privilege. So I wish you all the best with your conference, and thank you very much for attending.
Distinguished Chair, speakers, ladies and gentlemen, as we have come to the end of this session, we would like to express a sincere gratitude and thanks to the Chair for agreeing to chair and moderate the session today. Our sincere thanks also goes to all the speakers for being a part of the event and delivering such comprehensive and convincing presentations. We would like to acknowledge our gratitude to our friends from the diplomatic community, experts, academia, media, and different organizations. Finally, we must also mention our deep sense of appreciation for the audience who participated in the webinar and those who are watching us live. Thank you for your valuable time and attention and for making this session productive with your questions. Once again, we are truly honored to have you all with us today. Please do join us in the next session. Thank you so much.